Okay there, everybody. It looks like I'm showing 2 o'clock by my watch. We want to welcome everybody to the May 13th special meeting of the 2 Turlock Subbasin technical advisory committees. My name is Herb Smart, and I'll just be the host today until we get you to the leadership to run the meeting. Just a couple quick reminders that I have here up on the screen. Please don't put the call on hold. Please mute unless you wish to speak, and don't forget to unmute when it's your turn or when you wish to speak. We're going to have some public comment. We're going to have a designated public comment period. Feel free and speak on any matter not on the agenda listed when that comes up. And we'll also take comment at various portions of the agenda for the items that are listed on the agenda. If you are on the phone, you can unmute, or I think it's *6, but you should be fine. *9 raises your hand on the phone, and you could also use the Zoom feature to raise or unraise your hand as well, and mute and unmute yourself. We're recording the meeting, and it's going to be posted on the Turlock Groundwater YouTube page as soon as possible after this meeting, most likely tomorrow about midday is usually how long it takes. And the meeting materials, including the presentations, are available on turlockgroundwater.org. With that being said, I'm going to hand the meeting over to Michael for the West Turlock Subbasin GSA TAC, and I know that I believe it would either be Dennis or somebody else, because I know Kevin is out today, for the East Turlock Subbasin GSA TAC. So I'll put the agenda up and have at it.
Hey, thank you, Herb. This is Michael Cook from Turlock Irrigation District, representing the West Turlock Subbasin GSA. We need 7 members to call a quorum for the West Turlock. I believe we have 7. I see Leandro from Delhi, Walt from Stanislaus County, Debbie from TID, Miguel from the city of Modesto, Karen from the city of Ceres, Brody from Merced County, and David Odom from Denair. If I missed anybody from the West Turlock Subbasin Technical Advisory Committee. Okay, with that, I call the meeting to order at 2:02. So Matt or Dennis, you want to call your East Turlock group to order?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to take it over. Good afternoon. For East Turlock GSA Technical Advisory Committee, looks like we have Dennis with Liquid Cortez, Walt with Stanislaus County, I'm with Merced Irrigation District, and Merced County, unless maybe Brody's on. Merced County, okay, so Merced County is present, and Eastside Water District is not here. So at this point, I'll call the meeting to order at 2:03.
Okay, thanks everybody. So the first item on our agenda is public participation. This is the time set aside for members of the public to directly address the Technical Advisory Committee on any item of interest to the public that's within our subject matter, jurisdiction, or any item on the agenda. So if you want to speak about an agenda item, you can do that now, or you can leave those comments until that item comes up further down on the agenda. So with that, do we have any general public participation? Okay, not hearing anybody. Herb, do you have any hands raised?
I don't see anyone, Michael.
Okay, me neither. Okay, so moving on to item number 5. Undesirable results, reduction of groundwater in storage. So our technical team, Phyllis from Turlock Groundwater, will review and discuss the undesirable results regarding the groundwater in storage sustainability indicator. So over to you, Phyllis.
Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you again. I'm going to share a screen and we're going to walk through some PowerPoint slides as usual. Okay, let's get it to where we can page through this. All right, thanks very much again for always hanging in there with this group and coming to all of our meetings. We're going to be covering 3 agenda items briefly today. Agenda item number 5, which is undesirable results, and the minimum thresholds for groundwater reduction in groundwater and storage indicator. We'll have 2 additional agenda items that we'll be covering, and I'll have help with the sustainable yield modeling from our colleagues at Woodard and Curran. I want to just briefly review some things that you've seen before, just 3 quick slides that we've been through at least once and sometimes twice in the meetings. Our reduction of groundwater and storage indicator, as we're defining it here in the Turlock Subbasin, has really 2 aspects to consider. One is a depletion of supply, just the simple question of, are we going to run out of water if we keep doing what we're doing? And another question, another aspect of this is overdraft conditions in the subbasin, because it is causing some depletion. And so the issue, of course, is to think about whether or not the overdraft is causing a significant and unreasonable depletion with respect to this indicator. We have a very large volume of fresh groundwater in this subbasin. We've reviewed this cross-section, which runs essentially through the axis of the subbasin from the San Joaquin River on the left to the basin boundary on the right. And over a 25-year study period that we analyzed for the GSP process, we saw that we had depleted about 1.5 million acre feet of water from our subbasin groundwater in storage. That may seem like a lot. I would point out that we have done estimates, as has DWR, and we all come out with about the same amount of this very large volume of freshwater of groundwater in storage of about 30 million acre feet. So about 5% of our total groundwater in storage has been depleted over this time period, over a 25-year period. So Merced Subbasin GSP to the south of us, and then other GSPs in the Central Valley, have noted that they also have large volumes of fresh water beneath their basins, and that this small percentage, even though it has been depleted over a long period of time, the small percentage really suggests no risk of overall exhaustion or depletion of the total supply. And for the Merced Subbasin GSP, they suggested that this indicator was not applicable to their subbasin. We have had conversations with DWR about our large volume of freshwater in storage, which is indicated again. We looked at it in cross section, and this is an indication of map view. Some of the contours that we have on this map come from our C2VSUM integrated surface water groundwater model, and indicate 1,000 feet or more in some portions of the basin of column of fresh groundwater. In our conversations with DWR, they suggested considering alternatives to just relying on this concept of only depletion only being a very small percentage of the large volume of remaining groundwater, recognizing that some of the groundwater would be difficult to access if we continue to deplete supply. And so our GSP is required by the regulations to mitigate overdraft conditions, which is also a depletion of supply. So we were sort of combining this into this indicator, and are suggesting for the approach for this indicator in the Turlock Subbasin that we, number one, in our GSP, acknowledge the approach taken by the Merced Subbasin and document that we too, like the Merced Subbasin, are not at risk of depleting a very large percentage of our total volume of groundwater and storage. And then also recognize, however, that our overdraft depletion requires mitigation under the regulations. So we also recognize that the indicator, the reduction of groundwater and storage, is going to be supported by our sustainable yield analysis, which you're going to hear about in a little bit later here, as a volume that can be withdrawn from the groundwater basin without undesirable results. So the GSP regulations actually require that you consider and look at supporting the sustainable yield analysis, using that analysis as support for this indicator. And so there's really a nexus going on here between overdraft, lowering of water levels, and reduction of groundwater and storage, depleting a portion of the supply. And because of these overlaps that we've seen from a technical perspective, we'd like for the GSAs to consider using the same minimum thresholds that have already been established for chronic lowering of water levels in this basin as a proxy for the indicator for the reduction of groundwater and storage. This is consistent with the approach that was taken in the Delta Mendota subbasin, the northern and central GSP, which is, as you know, the Delta Mendota subbasin is very long, but the northern and central portion of that subbasin is the portion adjacent to us across the San Joaquin River. And other GSPs have taken this approach as well. And so in considering this, one of the things that we need to do in the GSP is to demonstrate this linkage between water levels and a storage volume so that we can use water levels as a proxy, because the regulations actually require that your minimum thresholds be based on a volume. So if we choose to use our minimum thresholds for the chronic lowering of water levels, that there is a nexus there. In particular, those MTs relate directly to and are supported by the sustainable yield volume. So there's that linkage to the volume, which is a metric required by the regulations. The MTs for chronic lowering of water levels also consider water year type and projected water use, other regulation considerations. And then also the MTs, of course, are very protective against depletion of supply and long-term overdraft, because the overdraft is directly related again to the lowering of water levels. The BMP does state that the storage should be monitored on a basin-wide basis rather than individual monitoring sites. But because this subbasin has selected minimum thresholds for the chronic lowering of water levels to be this continuous hydraulic surface, then we're really managing that indicator to a surface, and that surface is directly related to a volume. So it seems to me that there's quite a bit of overlap, quite a bit of linkage, quite a bit of nexus associated with all of the components from the chronic lowering of water level indicator to the reduction of groundwater and storage indicator. So those are the technical details and considerations of why I believe that the water level for minimum thresholds for chronic lowering of water levels would be reasonable to also use for reduction of groundwater and storage. And then I have that summarized on this slide. You all will recognize the format we've been using for our sustainable management criteria, where we have the undesirable result definition provided at the top, and then the method by which we will identify the undesirable result is shown at the bottom. So just beginning at the top, the undesirable result definition includes these two aspects of depletion of storage. The first one is significant and unreasonable reduction of groundwater and storage would occur if the volume of groundwater supply is at risk of depletion and or may not be accessible for beneficial uses. This is a nice nexus also with the chronic lowering of water level undesirable result definition. So we're looking at and showing quite a bit of overlap here. And then the second portion of the undesirable result definition reads, an undesirable result for this sustainability indicator would also occur if the subbasin remains in a condition of long-term overdraft based on projected water use and average hydrologic conditions. Because, someone has a little bit of music going here. Because again, that there's such an overlap of technical terms here, that second portion of the undesirable result incorporates the concept of overdraft. And then the methodology by which we would determine in the field that this is being exceeded is described as follows. The chronic lowering of water levels sustainability indicator is directly related to both depletion of supply and long-term overdraft conditions. Water level declines also have a direct correlation to the volume of groundwater in storage in overdraft conditions. And so based on that, the sustainable management criteria for the chronic lowering of water levels are protective of both depletion of supply and long-term overdraft. So there's how we've sort of made that connection and that nexus between using water levels as a proxy by, number one, showing that it's directly related to a volume, and number two, showing that it's protective of the undesirable result. So accordingly, water levels and their associated MTs are used as a proxy for the sustainability indicator. That's how we would word that. And I realize now that as I read that last sentence, we probably should say groundwater levels there rather than just water levels. We tend to shortcut that quite a bit, but I think it's important to have it there. And yeah, and so at this point, the ad hoc committee has reviewed this information and is comfortable with it and agrees with the approach. So we wanted to bring it to the full TAC to see if you have any questions on this or anything you'd like to discuss. And if you approve of the approach, at least on a preliminary basis, to move it forward in the GSP, we'd appreciate your approval process going forward on this now. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Yes, Phyllis.
Yes, hello, Milt.
This is Milt Treeweiler. I guess, again, I'm just a little bit mystified. We just entered an extreme drought condition, and we're basically ignoring, in my mind, we're ignoring reality. I mean, I've been in this area I was born here in Turlock almost 76 years ago, and I've seen the changes in the water level. Right now, I have a drought-tolerant garden in my yard. I took out all of my lawn. I have a drought-tolerant garden, and I have to shade some of my drought-tolerant plants because they're drying up. There is no water in the soil any longer. It's going away. How are you going to sustain agriculture if you don't have water in the surface? It looks like we're just going to pump it out until we become a desert. To me, it doesn't make sense. 1.5 million acre foot overdraft at this time. You say we have 30 million acre feet of fresh water, which again, I'd like to know again what the definition of fresh water is, because in the city of Turlock, we need potable fresh water. Maybe you can put arsenic on agricultural lands. You can't put nitrates on agricultural lands because that's going to sterilize the soil. But it just doesn't seem like this is scientific.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for those comments, Milton, an opportunity to clarify some things because I've clearly not been clear. So let me try to back up a bit. So with these sustainability indicators that we are defining in compliance with SGMA and compliance with the GSP regulations, we are mitigating, we're stopping the overdraft that has been occurring. We are acknowledging that we have not exhausted our large freshwater supply, and FYI, freshwater in this case is somewhere around, it depends on temperature, it depends on a lot of details, but I'm just going to throw out a number. It's somewhere around 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams per liter of total dissolved solids. So that's where that definition comes from, and we can talk offline about the details of that. But this sustainability indicator actually addresses exactly what you're concerned about. This is an attempt to stop the overdrafting conditions that we've had in this subbasin by bringing in our chronic lowering of water levels minimum thresholds. You might recall we've been talking about the chronic lowering of water levels as rates of decline throughout the subbasin where it's mostly occurring, what we have to work with. We've been looking at our domestic wells and how deep they are and how they've been impacted through the drought of record. We've been talking with our water suppliers about adverse impacts there. And the minimum thresholds that we selected as a subbasin for the chronic lowering of water levels was to take these levels no lower than the 2015 drought levels. We're going to stop the continual declines in the subbasin. Now, having said that, we need two things to be recognized. Thing number one is we can't turn the ship around in one day. We have some time under Sigma. It's going to take a little time, but this subbasin is committed to doing it. So overdraft will be mitigated. And these details, these frameworks, these undesirable results that we've been going through, that's the process to do that. So, so I recognize your concern about my talking about the Merced Subbasin's approach, that it's a small percentage. And I do think it's important to recognize that we are not running out of water, because I think that that is an overstatement of what's happening in the subbasin. Nonetheless, these criteria look to stopping the overdraft conditions. They look to stopping this continual chronic water level decline in the subbasin. So we are addressing exactly the types of things that you feel like need to be addressed, I believe. And maybe I'm missing a couple of your points. I'll just mention that arsenic and nitrate in particular is being handled at great expense by the growers in this subbasin. There is an irrigated lands program being implemented and regulated by the Central Valley Water Board, and they are requiring growers to reach out to homeowners and see if nitrate levels have impacted their water supply wells. And if they have, then growers are being obligated to take care of that. So I do feel like we're making some progress. It may feel incredibly slow, but I do think we're addressing the right things. And I'll be glad to see if I've missed something.
Just one additional comment.
Sure.
With climate change, how will we ever bring these levels back? The scientists are telling us that the Central Valley is going to have less rainfall. We're going to have less snowfall. It's going to be typically like it is this year. Is it possible to bring our water levels back with a year like we have this year? We're going to have many, 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 many more of these type of years. By 2075, we're not going to have any snow in the mountains any longer. So how is it going to be possible to bring these levels back?
So a couple of comments to that. I appreciate your comments so much. We have done the climate change analysis, as you might have kind of seen, that we did identify that there would be a reduction of soil moisture in the subbasin, as well as less snow, a little more rain actually in some areas, but certainly less snow. And as a result of that, we're going to have to manage things differently. So that's overall, that's the short answer to that. But I do want to address also your concerns of, how will we ever bring back these higher levels? And I think the answer to that is maybe that won't happen. But one of the things that we can do now is to address what has been happening with respect to the overdraft and address that quite aggressively and directly. And that's what I feel like that this basin is trying to do. So perhaps the water levels won't recover to the highs that they have been in the past, but our goal here is to stop the declines.
Hey, Phyllis, this is Michael. Maybe for a point of clarification, you mentioned that change in storage will be controlled by the minimum threshold we've established for the chronic lowering of groundwater levels. What is that minimum threshold? So what can we expect to aim for over time?
What we have established for the chronic lowering of water levels, and I believe this happened on April 22nd, anyone could go back and look at the PowerPoint that we had, or the recording we had for that. The technical advisory committees approved the low level that occurred during the 2015 drought of record. So we're calling that our new floor, and we don't want to be able to operate the subbasin below those levels for any long period of time, or allow the water levels to decline over time well beyond that.
Phyllis, this is Rhett Calkins.
Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
So when we establish the minimum thresholds and it's a hydrological surface and it has a shape to it, an elevation, are we committing to a permanent shape that shows the Kona Depression in the east, and we'll forever have a net subsurface flow of approximately 81,000 acre feet from the west to the east?
So it's not a perfect shape, but let me just start there and say that I have represented it as such, but there will be some changes that will occur, especially with projects and management actions. Some of the shape will look different. So we're not committing to sort of keeping everything exactly the same, but we are committing to, stopping the overall decline. So we're establishing a floor more than we're establishing a shape. The point that I wanted to make about the shape relates directly to the requirements of the regulations when you're showing a nexus between two of these sustainability indicators. You need to show how they relate one to the other. And because 2015 floor is a shape or a hydraulic surface, as we call it, then that's where that came in. So the answer to your question is it will look differently than it looks right now, but it won't look. It may not look, exceptionally different. It's just hard to figure that out right now, and we'll be able to give you more information over the next couple of months as we analyze the projects and management actions.
Yeah, I'm real curious why the shape will look different from what I've heard already. It sounds like we're etching this in stone. Well, we're by setting them minimum thresholds to the 2015 levels. We know what the levels were. We can look at the well logs from 2015. I assume that's what we're referring to, because that's all we have. We can't go back to 2015 and insert a bunch of test wells. Those are going to be done later. So we're going off of what data we have in 2015. And if that's what we're doing, then we're kind of setting in stone that shape.
Well, we're not actually setting. I'm so sorry. This is just a little bit of a point to make here, but we're not setting the shape in stone because the projects and management actions will change that shape. It may be an overall storage, but if we have a recharge in a project in a certain area, then that will raise water levels there, so to speak. If we have another project that will do something different, then it may change the shape there. So what we're establishing is a bit of a floor, I call it. It's something that we don't want to go below, at least for any extended period of time. Sigma does allow you to go a little below it, but you have to recover back to it. So it isn't as if the shape is set in stone, but we have established ourselves a reasonable floor. Does that help a little bit?
I'll go with that for now. I appreciate it, Phyllis. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? I see that there's some hands raised. I didn't. Okay. Anyone else have anything you'd like to say with respect to what we've been talking about or this?
Mike Day here. I don't have any problem with what we're putting forth here. I do think the climate change is certainly a big deal, and as we document this linkage between the storage of groundwater and storage, and the chronic lowering of water levels, it has to be with a look forward based on all of our modeling looking forward as opposed to looking backward and what happened in the past. So I assume we'll be doing that.
Absolutely. In fact, you'll hear about that in just a few minutes when we talk about the sustainable yield modeling, because this is, recall that we've done a 50-year projected water budget. We did the climate change analysis on top of that as well. And the sustainable yield modeling is another sort of 50-year projection going forward, looking at the minimum thresholds.
Hey Phyllis, this is Walt. I want to put a slightly different spin, and that is this. There's a tremendous volume of water in storage, and not all of it is accessible or usable under today's, economic conditions. But who knows what the world will be 50 years from now? Most of us will be gone, and I would trust that these regs, these MTs that we're setting in place pursuant to the GSP regs, can change over time as the hydrology changes. We were just talking about climate change, and social and economic conditions also change to where, 50 years from now, say there's no snowpack and everything's rain driven, people are going to have to rely on the groundwater. And so we're being, I think, conservative and in a good way in setting these levels to preserve for tomorrow. And I think I think that's an important aspect, that if these MTs have to change, or these MTs are in fact variables that will change or should change as we gain more information, and frankly, as the world about us, changes in its the hydrology and all the other social factors. So that's my little soapbox.
Thank you, Walt. You always have the good 30,000-foot view. It's fabulous. Thanks. Anyone else?
Hey, Phyllis, it's Val. I have a quick
Yes.
question. This looks good, and I think most, like you said, I think a lot of folks are doing this and makes sense. These two sustainability indicators are so intertwined. And a question on that interconnection: are we in the chapter going to talk about or estimate the storage loss at our MT level, so we can kind of tell DWR, we know we're protecting storage because when we hit our elevations, this is how such a small amount of storage is depleted? Are we gonna do that?
Absolutely, Valerie. That's a really good point. And that was what I was trying to point out, that we need that volume. We need it to be a metric. We need to link the water level to volume. So absolutely, we're doing that. We're going to start doing that in the sustainable yield modeling, which is coming right up next. So thanks for that.
Sure, yeah, thank you.
Michael, if there's no other questions, maybe the TAC could consider moving forward with this.
Absolutely. Phyllis, thank you so much, and thank you for the public participation. With that, I turn it over to my colleagues in the West Turlock Subbasin Technical Advisory Committee, whether we have a motion to take action and adopt this sustainable management criteria.
Great job, Phyllis. This is Curtis. So moved.
We have a motion from Curtis with Hilmar. Do we have a second?
Walt Ward, second.
Second from Walt. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, so with that, the motion stands approved. Thank you, everybody. Now I'll turn it over to the East Turlock guys.
Thank you for the presentation, Phyllis, and the discussion. Appreciate the discussion too. I'll entertain a motion to recommend the undesirable results for groundwater and storage that were presented.
Walt Ward, move approval.
Okay, second.
This is Brody. I can second that.
All right, we got a second from Merced County. For all those in favor, please say aye.
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 Aye. For those opposed? Okay, motion carries. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, moving on to item number 6, sustainable yield modeling. Review and discuss phase 1 of the sustainable yield analysis. Over to, I believe this is going to be Dominic of Wood and Kern.
It is going to be Dominic, but because I have just on a roll here, I'm gonna just say a couple of things myself first. So thank you again for allowing us to come to you with the sustainable yield modeling analysis. Woodard and Curran has done all of the work and they're going to take over this, but I wanted to bring the group up to speed because I have been the one that has sort of introduced this in the past, so you might be a little bit more familiar with my words. And so I wanted to just impose my 2 cents on what you're about to hear. So sustainable yield has a definition in Sigma, and it's shown here, the amount of groundwater that can be withdrawn annually without causing undesirable results. These minimum thresholds that we've been selecting in all of these meetings, that's how we're defining those undesirable results. So this is the modeling process by which those are evaluated. The regulations require that this be done and that it be a portion of the water budget. And one single value has to be calculated basin-wide. This is from DWR guidance. So the way that we've approached it here, we've used the C2V sim modeling, and we're doing this in phases. And you're going to see phase 1 today. Phase 1 is the really iterative process. Phase 1 is where the modeling team looks at how much water is it that we're going to need to meet with our projects and management actions in order to meet these minimum thresholds. And to do that, the easiest way to do it within the model is to just simply take out pumping. So they've been reducing pumping, not because they know where it might occur or how they're trying to analyze this. They are just simply doing this in the model to come up with some sort of a target for the volumes of water that we've all been talking about that represent sustainable yield. One of the things that happened during the sustainable yield modeling, and the reason that we didn't get it to you as quickly as we wanted to, is because as we began going iteratively back and forth looking at the MTs, we recognized that the MTs that this group had actually already approved on the Merced River didn't actually achieve what we needed to achieve with respect to undesirable results. And so this called out for revisions to that MT for interconnected surface water. You might recall that we set interconnected surface water MTs at the 2015 water levels, just like we did chronic lowering of water levels. We were able to meet the chronic lowering of water level MT, but we couldn't meet the MTs along the Merced River without having more stream flow depletion. And so as a result of that, the modeling team, again, iteratively revised things back, dialed things back, and we worked directly with Merced Irrigation District. And I like to do a shout out. I don't think they're, Matt and is on the phone today, and we appreciate Hisham's and Matt's focus and good technical information that they've been providing with respect to impacts on surface water uses on the Merced. And as a result of that, they were able to help from the operational standpoint, they were able to help us identify more reasonable minimum thresholds at spring 2014 levels. So you're going to hear about how we looked at 2015 levels and then we changed it to 2014 levels. And with that, thank you for letting me take over the conversation one more time. And I'm now going to turn it over to Dominic Amador with Woodard and Curran. He and Ali Tagavi have been the ones managing and doing all of this detailed and highly technical modeling work. So Dominic, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Phyllis. And thank you everyone for participating this afternoon. Just to verify, can everyone see my screen, or can someone give me a thumbs up?
Yes, we're good.
Okay, thank you. So with that excellent introduction from Phyllis, I wanted to kind of give a little bit of our own, a little bit more kind of purely modeling specific. She gave us a great summary of the pathway that we're going to go today, covering a lot of kind of the topics, and hopefully I can provide you the similar information, but with a little bit more detail, kind of explain that iterative process that she spoke to, kind of help guide you through the process, both what we saw as far as data going into and coming out of the model. And so you can have a better understanding of really what is sustainable yield, how we're simulating it, and what are the impacts that we're going to see long term. So to first kick off the kind of diving into the details, we really wanted to go over really what is sustainable yield and what is our goal for the modeling. And so the overarching goal for this is to really just to estimate the volume of groundwater that we can produce to achieve the sustainability conditions as defined by Sigma, and this group has been working over the past many months to set those sustainability criteria. And so really, but how we're going to go about doing that is we're going to use the model that we've developed for the Turlock Basin. We're going to use this locally designed CTV sim model, the baseline, the 50-year baseline of this model, to assess kind of the various minimum thresholds that we've set as a group. And so particularly the ones that we're going to be really focusing on today, really the ones that are going to be predominantly kind of more modeling centric, and the ones we can really answer well with the model are going to be groundwater storage, water levels, and then overall that interconnectivity of surface water, stream depletions, and things to that effect. Now, similar to the conversation that we had in the kind of over the past half hour, when it comes to both overall groundwater storage and the land subsidence here, both of them pseudo use a proxy utilizing overall groundwater levels set at those 2015 minimum thresholds, but I'll cover them both here, just letting you know they're kind of more of a secondary factor to the focus, which is our groundwater levels and our interconnected surface water system. So when it comes to the overall approach, we've really kind of broken up this model into really two modeling steps and one preliminary kind of a setup step. So really kind of what I'm kind of considering our phase 0 is all the work that all of you did for me. It's to really taking the idea of taking and developing the minimum thresholds, developing the targets for a lot of my modeling, and that work has already been done. Then where I get to take take a hold of the situation is really what we're going to consider here is phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 is what I'm get to present to all of you today, and hopefully we get to return shortly with a phase 2 version of the model. But phase 1, really what we're going to focus on is what we're considering a demand side solution. As Phyllis mentioned, this is a very kind of direct means of getting at the problem. The idea being that we, on a very large scale, we can reduce the agriculture and urban overall pumping and the consumptive use of across both of those entities. And I'll get to in a minute. I'll get to show you kind of how we do that and kind of where we're doing that. But overall, the general approach for both of these kind of phases is to utilize the model to look at what we're considering long-term sustainability. We acknowledge that with kind of the variable hydrology that we have over the sustainability period, we are going to see ups and downs in both our water levels, in our storage, and particularly in localized conditions. But the idea being that in a long-term period, over this 50-year period, that in general we will be kind of staying relatively flat. And I'll kind of get into that again in a little bit higher detail shortly. And then the other component here is that while we're looking at minimum thresholds, that those minimum thresholds are the exact wells and exact locations for those minimum thresholds has not quite been set yet. It's kind of a work in progress, and so we will see some minor tweaks to this process, but that overall we're pretty confident and comfortable with the path moving forward. So to really kind of give you an idea of what are some of the sustainability indicators that the modeling focused effort can give for us. And these are really going to be these kind of 3 main components that I'm going to really be focusing on today. This is Sigma indicators number 1, 2, and 6. And so overall, when we look at chronic lowering of groundwater levels, this is where I'm going to kind of go through a series of hydrographs with the group, and we can kind of get an idea of what some of the impacts are under different sustainability and demand reduction efforts can be. In addition to that, we're going to look at that overall reduction in groundwater storage. As I mentioned, we're with a 50-year period, our goal is to bring that long-term 50-year change and storage to zero. And that really goes back to the conversation that, you know, kind of the first part of this presentation that Phyllis presented a few minutes ago. And then the last component here, when we get to what is considered kind of the indicator 6, is looking at the streams of interconnected surface water systems, and really to be able to make sure that the subbasin does not have a significant and unreasonable impact on the beneficial uses of surface water. So when it comes to kind of the general process, I already kind of mentioned that we're going through what is considered kind of my phase 0, 1, and 2. Well, today, phase 1 is really where the bulk of our information comes. But before we kind of get to that, the details associated with that 0 phase where we set minimum thresholds is going to be, you know, again, looking at groundwater storage, looking at water levels, and then looking at the idea of maintaining surface water connectivity. And as Phyllis mentioned, the idea for that being that we are, as a kind of a little bit of a hint, is that we are increasing minimum thresholds, or we were recommended to perform an analysis of increasing the minimum thresholds along the river boundaries to spring of 2014. And how are we going to go about doing that? The idea behind this is that we reduce the overall net consumptive use of what we're considering the net extractors of the basin. From that point, we're going to develop kind of an initial set of yields based on kind of some of the easier targets to hit, and at which point we're going to dive even deeper and evaluate some of the minimum thresholds and get into that iterative process where we get to refine the simulations to meet some of the localized conditions across the basin. And really, the last component of this is to really kind of make sure I share with you that really, that being this iterative process, the goal is kind of that we hit each of these major items kind of sequentially. Changing groundwater storage is by far kind of the easiest pathway or the easiest goal to achieve. It usually requires the greatest it requires the most lenient demand reduction effort to hit, right? Because what this means is this is targeting kind of sub-basin totals. We're not looking at any kind of localized conditions. And so when we look at the basin as a whole, we really kind of have the first step. At which point, in order to look at specific kind of some of the more localized areas, looking at groundwater levels at kind of some specific wells, we generally have to go a little bit further when it comes to the demand reduction to be able to make sure that we meet our goals across all the minimum threshold wells that we have, and that we're not leaving certain areas of the basin kind of out to dry. And then when it comes to kind of the third and the final category here is we have stream depletions. And so that's what that means is we actually, in general, because our minimum thresholds along the rivers, particularly the Merced River, is going to be, that minimum threshold is going to be higher than a lot of areas. Generally, that means that we have to take kind of an extra step as far as demand reduction goes to be able to meet the goals of as far as meeting those minimum thresholds. And so usually what happens is kind of the intensity or the amount of work that we need to do as a basin to meet each of these goals increases from kind of one step to the next. And I'll walk you through that and kind of show you how we get to each of here. But the idea is once we're all done with this whole process and we have, you know, our full demand reduction scenario built, is that we hit all three of these targets in a single run. So then to dive into really exactly how we're doing this process, how exactly it is that we're, you know, kind of what areas of the basin are going to be, you know, experiencing demand reduction, and then kind of what the magnitudes of that is. First, we got to set up and answer the question as far as really where are these demand reductions going to occur. And so at the kind of guidance and recommendation of the ad hoc group, we broke really the basin into kind of what we're considering two main groups. One is going to be the net contributors to the basin as far as groundwater operations go, and these are predominantly the agencies in the areas that are on both have surface water supply and groundwater supply. Those are our net contributors to the basin. So predominantly in the kind of this purplish color here, you can see we have the city of Turlock, excuse me, the Turlock Irrigation District, Merced Irrigation District, and the riparian surface water users. And so you can kind of see those around the basin in the blue. And that's predominantly going to be from an agricultural perspective. On the other hand, we also have what are considered either the groundwater only users or the kind of the net extractors from the basin, and that includes kind of all the major municipalities that you can see kind of listed here, both listed on here on the right, and then also I've kind of given you kind of the spatial location and highlighted in this green because they are part of group 2. Those are urban or municipal users. Now also, in addition to that, we also have agricultural users that are within group 2, and those are going to be those agricultural users who are entirely dependent on the groundwater system. oops, sorry, before, so and really with that, and through kind of working through various iterations of kind of the analysis and looking at really kind of the impacts that have been historically occurring in the basin. We, in conjunction with the ad hoc group, have kind of recommended to move forward with really focusing a lot of the demand reduction to what we're considering these group 2 users, kind of effectively all the users that are on groundwater only. And so for the remainder of the slides, you can kind of imagine that that all demand reduction in this effort that we've kind of gone through is going to be kind of imposed on any group 2 users here. So anybody that you can see in green on this map. So again, going back to that first step, what does it take to bring our basin into a kind of an even playing field as far as storage goes? Well, on the right hand, you can see kind of what our projected conditions baseline. We've gone over this kind of several times in various TAC meetings, in that the model is projecting that that if we continue everything as today and as we project forward into the future, that in the long term, over 50-year period, we're going to see a general overall decline and change in storage. It's kind of this black line you can see here. The goal of that first step is to really bring the black line to end at 0, the cumulative change in storage over the 50-year period to kind of be flat. And as I mentioned earlier, the idea of that is that we're looking at a 50-year planning horizon. We acknowledge that there is going to be variability in hydrology, and we're going to continue to have droughts. We're going to continue to have wet periods, and that that both our model and that the basin as a whole can react to those and we can make exceptions for particularly tough years, allowing for the basin to recover from each of those periods. And that's why you see in this sustainability period, we can see periods where water levels will actually rise over time. And then in a couple of drought periods, you see here couple times where we see the overall storage dropping. Those are generally indicative of long and intense drought periods. And so you can kind of recognize each of the major drought periods based on their corresponding hydrologic years here in this figure. The idea being that we are going to be allowing the basin as a whole to periodically rise and lower when it comes to overall change in storage. We kind of have a big bathtub, and we can rise and we can lower. We just can't empty it out, or we can't go below what we're considering those minimum thresholds. And so we will see some variability in storage. But overall, what we can see is that this first step, and kind of that first kind of the easiest of these apples to pick, so to speak, is going to be a kind of a general 12% reduction across our group 2 users in order to meet this sustainability condition. Now, as much as I'd like to kind of stay at that 12% reduction, that we're not able to hit really a lot of our goals. And so we kind of have to kind of tighten the belt a little bit further, and so to speak, in order to meet the next goals, which are going to be the chronic lowering of groundwater levels. So when we talk about chronic lowering of groundwater levels, really the idea behind this is to take whereas the change in storage is really looking at the subbasin as a whole, right? It's that big bathtub. Chronic lowering of groundwater levels is when we kind of get to localized conditions. It's where we want to make sure that there's no kind of specific part of the subbasin that has, that is continuing to decline, where the rest of the subbasin does not. And so when we try to look at kind of some of these more localized conditions, the idea being is that we set a minimum threshold. And there's been a lot of speak in the past of wanting to set the minimum thresholds across the entire basin as the low water point in 2015. And so that's where we're going to look at the next couple slides. But the idea being that as we kind of look at these overall water levels, very similar to the change in storage, that we will still expect water levels in addition to storage to fluctuate. It's going to go up in wet years and it's going to go down in dry years, or particularly if we have several dry years or a drought, we are going to see those water levels decline. And so really one of the big kind of questions for discussion, particularly hopefully kind of towards the end of this presentation, we can kind of open the floor for some greater discussion, is going to be the fact that the sigma overall allows groundwater levels to temporarily go below our minimum thresholds, and that's going to be critical. And the idea being that during drought, we understand that the basin will be stressed in particularly dry periods, and that is okay as to a degree as long as there exists a mechanism for recovery, being that we can temporarily go below a minimum threshold, but we cannot permanently go below a minimum threshold. And that I think the discussion point that we can get to towards the end of the conversation is going to be really, well, what is the basin or what is the TAC as a whole want to set as temporary? I think that that definition can be has some flexibility in it from the perspective of the state. So when it comes to looking at a couple different locations, what I have thrown here is I have a couple series of hydrographs to show you really what we are been looking at historically, what we will expect to see under the baseline, and then what we will are simulating as the impacts in this scenario as sustainable yield. And so to kind of walk through that for anybody who hasn't seen a lot of these charts from me, is we really kind of see four main colors on these charts. So the first one, kind of focusing on the first third of each of these charts, is going to be what we consider the historical period. And so that's why we actually also have observed data during the historical period. So this gives us an idea. All these little black dots give us an idea of really how well is the model simulating observed data. And so really when the model, you can see here that the model is showing kind of this light blue color, we can see that overall that the model fairly well represents the groundwater levels at these hydrographs. And so that we have a fairly calibrated model, we can really represent really what the operations of the basin, the conditions within the basin. Now from here, the second 2/3 of the chart being the 50-year period versus a 25-year historical, but the next 2/3 is effectively what we're considering the baseline comparatively to our sustainable yield simulation. And so we have the baseline here in this kind of orange color, and we have the sustainable yield with our demand reduction incorporated. We have the sustainable yield in this blue. So as you'd expect, if we reduce the overall demand, the overall stresses of the aquifer system, we would anticipate water levels rising overall. And then the last color that I want to bring your attention to is what I'm considering we have labeled here as MT, which is what our minimum thresholds is. And this is what the model is simulating as the low point in 2015. Now, for the sake of this presentation, the minimum thresholds are set at what the model simulates the bottom of 2015, not necessarily the observed data. And I'll kind of show you that in this slide, but probably the next one we'll show you an example of this. But this is really because the minimum thresholds, as far as the specific wells, as far as the specific water levels, and that kind of goes back to the fact that that is a process that Phyllis and her team are currently actively working on. So I don't have an exact well and exact minimum thresholds to work with you all today, but this is kind of just give us a conceptual idea of really how are we doing when it comes to these observations. So overall, what we can kind of see here is if we look at the kind of this minimum threshold, is that in general, particularly in this well in kind of the far northwest corner of the basin, you can see that the baseline for the most part meets this minimum threshold, and it does cross below the minimum threshold occasionally, but it fits fairly minimally and it recovers very quickly. Similarly, sustainable yield is entirely above that minimum threshold line, so that's a
Dominic,
good thing to see. Yes, sir.
May I interfere or just for a second?
Please.
Is this supposed to be with climate change, or this is the way it would be if there was no such thing as climate change? Is this graph that you're talking about with climate change or without climate change?
This is without climate change. So the baseline version of this is what we're considering the projected conditions baseline. And so this is without the climate change scenario. Okay, and that's going to be predominantly because DWR doesn't require us to do a lot of our planning with the assumptions within the climate change model, and so that would be just kind of an extra consideration that we could look at down the road. Okay, unless there's any other questions, I'll kind of keep going. But please, anybody feel free to interrupt me if anything pops into your head. So as we kind of move further, staying kind of along our northern boundary, but moving a little further to the east, we can see in another very similar hydrograph where we can see the water levels overall dropping in the historical period, but both when it comes to the baseline and sustainable yield, we can see an increase in the water levels under sustainable yield. And again, it's kind of a very similar to the previous, is that the baseline does exceed the minimum thresholds, in which case the sustainable yield run, while it does so for a much shorter period, and that can be one of the again going back to our discussion item at the end. So then on the then if we kind of continue looking around the basin, kind of getting us the centralized look in the west. Western GSA, we kind of see two more wells again covering this kind of the historical period, and then again going into the looking at the kind of the long-term baseline and sustainable yield. And particularly again in here you can see that the thresholds for both the baseline and the sustainable yield are below our minimum threshold, but again we have that mechanism to recover. So again, long term we're seeing ourselves recover each time there's the dip, and we can account for those things. And so that's showing that, you know, for the most part we're fairly in compliance with our Sigma regulations. And then again, now moving a little bit further, kind of seeing more southerly and moving further to the east, we can see kind of a very similar conditions here, where in the, you know, particularly in the east, in areas where, you know, we definitely do not have the surface water that the west has, we can see a kind of much more generalized decline over time in the baseline. And really a lot of what the goal of this exercise is to really show that kind of long-term flattening out of the sustainable conditions. And that's why we can see really the focus of the sustainable yield simulation here, staying above this minimum threshold long term. And so and similarly here, as the further south we get, it comes to, you know, you can see the baseline is kind of regularly exceeding those minimum thresholds. Then our sustainable yield run kind of on a long-term basis stays above, even if it has an occasional component. Now, if I can, you know, make sure I kind of bring your attention, everybody kind of give a mental snapshot of this well 119 here, because being so adjacent to the Merced River, this is going to be the one one of the ones that we're going to focus as we get into minimum thresholds as far as looking at interconnected surface water bodies. And I'll kind of be able to explain how we've changed the minimum thresholds, or how changing minimum thresholds to 2014 water levels comparatively to 2015 levels, what the impacts of that are. Oops, excuse me. So taking a look, diving then into the kind of what we're considering our phase. Our third part of phase one is going to be to do an analysis to validate the sustainable yield under considering depletions of interconnected surface water systems. And this comes to the fact that overall Sigma requires requires us to account for induced stream depletions as an undesirable result affecting surface water uses. So Sigma, even though it is a sustainable groundwater management, we must take into account that we cannot just pull infinite amount of water from the adjacent surface water systems as well. And so we need to make sure that we're kind of good stewards of the land and sustainable from our river system as well. And so overall, the vast majority of our analysis is really focused in on the Tuolumne and the Merced River, and because particularly under the baseline, both of these rivers are at risk of losing a lot of the interconnectivity of the system, and that basically a lot of the water kind of in the interaction between the stream and the aquifer system is we're inducing a lot more stream seepage, and particularly to the north, we're losing a lot of the flow that moves from the aquifer system into the river. And when it comes to the Merced River, we're at risk of overall completely losing the hydraulic connection overall, and that which is kind of a key operational feature that the Merced Irrigation District relies on to their water operations, and that they, as well as us as a basin, consider disconnection a significant and unreasonable impact. And so these are things that we need to definitely take into consideration when we develop a kind of a sustainable yield, when we develop the sustainable yield analysis. So overall, even though the current standing of the minimum thresholds, kind of as voted upon by the TAC, is to set minimum thresholds at 2015. Kind of through the modeling analysis, we have kind of decided the idea that these minimum thresholds did not sufficiently guard against stream depletion. That utilizing those thresholds, we still saw a good amount of stream depletions. We saw the Merced River particularly becoming more and more disconnected over time, and these are things that we need to protect under Sigma. So there's a lot of coordination between kind of our technical consultant team, the ad hoc committee as a whole. We get as representatives from both GSAs, as well as representatives from MID who, while also part of the East Turlock Subbasin GSA, are kind of wearing the double hat of, discussing their operational impacts as well when it comes to the Merced River. And so kind of through all of that coordination, they recommended that we increase minimum thresholds, particularly along the rivers and particularly along the Merced River, to increase that threshold to the spring of 2014 water levels basically along the river boundaries. And so if we want to take a look at well, I just asked you kind of to take a mental snapshot of, particularly the 119 one here in this purple is the one I showed on the previous slide, and 113 as well. It's kind of right adjacent to it, but again, along the Merced River. And the idea behind this is that I really wanted to show that under the previous version of the model, the previous version of sustainable yield that we had, really what we can see here is that increasing the minimum threshold, so this kind of dotted green line, really it moved from about this upper 30s level. I think it's set at 38. We can see that we have to increase that to kind of protect the river system. We have to increase that minimum threshold to the spring of 2014 water levels and bring it up to this point here. So really what this signaled to us, and this is again going back to that iterative process of developing your sustainable yield, is that the stream conditions set from the previous the minimum thresholds under previous conditions did not achieve the desired results of mitigating stream depletions. And so we set this new minimum threshold, and then because this is an iterative solution, the sustainable yield model, a version of the model that we had, did not meet this minimum threshold goal. And so which turned back into us, kind of dialing the knob up a little bit to see what it takes to achieve this kind of sustainability indicator. So, and really this is where it comes to looking at kind of the whole modeling process of looking at interconnected surface waters, and again, the component of the iteration process is that we wanted to take an evaluation at looking at across a lot of different options when it comes to overall demand reduction. You can see that the baseline with the 0% demand reduction, we know for a fact won't work. Option 1 with the 25% from the previous slides, we know aren't going to meet our 2014 conditions. And so because of that, we wanted to run several iterations of the model, several different versions and scenarios of the model to evaluate different levels of increasing demand reduction to be able to determine really what would be the optimum threshold for us to be able to meet the sustainability criteria. And so for really quick, kind of getting into to give you all a little bit more detail as far as really what does this mean from a true volume number, because we've been talking a lot of percentages up to this point, but really kind of putting some real numbers as far as really what as it comes to our sustainability in the basin, is I wanted to kind of really take a moment to go through this table. And so overall, this is what we're considering the overall pumping in the baseline for our group 2 users. And again, group 2 users are anybody in this on this map in the bottom corner here, anybody in green. So we have a lot of the eastern areas, the groundwater dominant areas in the east, and in the west, we have all the major municipalities. As they are entirely on groundwater, they are considered our group 2 users. And so if I sum all those up in the baseline, we're estimating 260,000 acre feet of pumping. And really that's where a lot of the basis of these demand reductions are. So you can see here that the base pumping in all these scenarios is 260,000. And then if you multiply that 260,000 by the reduction volume, and so actually the reduction volume, so 25% in this case of option 1, 25% of 260,000 is 67,000. But in addition to that, then the inverse of that, so kind of the remainder, the 75% that we're considering our sustainable yield, is the 193. And so as you can see, as we increase the demand reduction, the overall adjusted pumping volumes decreases, and that's what we're going to kind of be simulating. And that's what we're going to be looking at the next couple of slides, is what are the impacts to water levels adjacent to the river system when under a couple of these different scenarios. And so when it comes to looking at these, each of these different scenarios, I want to kind of have everybody keep in mind kind of three main goals. The one is the idea of the impacts to meeting these proposed minimum thresholds. And what I mean by impacts is, really how much of a cut, how much of a reduction, what that reduction means to the basin, to the people that, and to the users that are going to be, operating their systems on this water that is reduced from the aquifer system. And the other two components here are really kind of more focused on the minimum thresholds, and they're going to be really focused on the two main components of idea between the fact that we are allowed to exceed the minimum thresholds on occasion. And so I want to, really kind of make sure you bring it, kind of keep it in your head, the regularity that these minimum thresholds are exceeded under each of these, some of these conditions, and the duration that these minimum thresholds are in exceedance, whether that is a couple months, a year, 2 years, or so to speak. So kind of keep that in mind, because those are where we'll come back to this slide here with some new set of numbers, and we can kind of discuss that. I think it's going to be the main discussion point for the day. So particularly focusing on these two wells, for the sake of time, I'm really going to just kind of keep, really kind of draw your attention to two primary runs. We have a 35% demand reduction, and we have a 40% demand reduction. And this is going to be, and kind of similarly, as you would expect, as we increase the volume of demand reduction, our water levels increase. And so you can see here kind of that overall with a 35% reduction, if implemented immediately, over time, we would see an increase in water levels. And it would take about, it would take about 10 years for those water levels to rebound to the point in which we are above the minimum threshold. At which point, particularly for this 35% reduction, is that you can see that for the most part in, I would say for over a majority of the time steps, we see that this well in particular is going to be, that this well in particular is above the minimum threshold, but it does on occasion, and it does to a certain degree of regularity, we do exceed that minimum threshold, although it does recover, in under various conditions. And so I think one of the points that we're going to be that kind of going to open to the floor in a minute is they got this idea where the 35% reduction, it in general kind of meets it a majority of the time, but it definitely is out of compliance with our proposed minimum thresholds fairly regularly. On the other hand, if we increase that to 40%, the total simulated water levels at this particular well are going to be very irregularly out of compliance, very regularly in compliance, other than a few minor dips in drought periods. That overall we see that we are very consistently above that minimum threshold with a 40% reduction. Now, similarly, if we look into the other well that I have here, we can see kind of a very similar trend in which we would expect overall, with being wells both adjacent to a river and fairly adjacent and fairly close to each other overall, is that we can see that, again, a continued increase in water level over the first 10-year period of the scenario, at which point we can see that the 35% in general is 50% of the time is above this threshold, but it's a good percentage of it. I think it's about 15 to 25% of the time we are out of compliance. And then additionally, similarly with the 40%, when it comes down here, we are that out of compliance time period and regularity really comes only in drought periods, and it only comes for about 4% of the time overall. So I told you we would return to this lovely table. And so effectively what we can see here, and this is really what we're kind of summarizing kind of on a more statistical approach, is I kind of, the previous slide had this first half of the table. And now we have been including it to looking at those two specific wells from the previous slide. Is what we can see here kind of as our indicator wells for the Merced River sustainability, is that overall we can see that as you increase the overall demand reduction, the percent of the time, or the number. So first we have the number of events or monthly readings in this case, the number of times that we are out of compliance, or we are below the minimum threshold, decreases over time, and decreases over as we increase our demand reduction, we decrease our pumping. Now the percentage of that time overall is kind of showed here, and you can see here that when it comes to the 35 and the 40% simulation that for the hydrographs that I showed you, options 3 and options 4, you can see that under the option 3, which is the 35% demand reduction, we see a total 15% of the time in general we all have exceeded our minimum thresholds. And so, as I said, a majority of the time we are meeting it, but there is still a solid 15% of the time that we are out of compliance. On the other hand, if we increase that to 40%, that number drops to only 4%. Similarly, when it comes to kind of the maximum consecutive months, so kind of the maximum duration at which we are out of compliance is going to be kind of 8 months and 5 months respectively. And that's going to be predominantly because we will see some recovery being very close to a river system. We generally see a lot of recovery in the winter months. And so because of that, you see that that we generally, these are summertime, or I would say generally irrigation period. We're out of compliance for several months, and then we will kind of return in the winter. And so I think for the most part, we should really kind of be focusing on this 15 versus 4% when it comes to looking at our minimum, how we interact with our minimum thresholds. And then the last component here that I wanted to really draw your attention to, because well 13 and well 19 are very similar. So we see 15 and 4 under both of these wells. Is this last component here is really to separate out now, is to answer the question, well, we know that group 2 is experiencing a lot of demand reduction. We can see those percentages very indicative of the overall demand reduction percentage over here. But what does that mean for the basin as a whole, right? What is our total sustainable yield? Kind of what's the take home after redoing all this analysis? And really what we can see here is that under the baseline that we currently are estimating our pumping in the 50-year period to be about 414,000 acre feet a year. And the idea being that depending on which one of these options we choose, predominantly if we want to focus in on 3 and 4 here, is that predominantly that the sustainable yield of the basin, if the TAC moves forward with adopting one of these options, is going to be targeted at somewhere between 311 and 323,000 acre feet a year. Okay, so overall, before we kind of really get into the discussion aspect, is overall the results show that a demand reduction of 35 to 40% appears to meet the established management criteria set forth, which is, again, it's 2015 water levels in the vast majority of the basin, and spring of 2014 water levels near the rivers in order to protect the interconnected surface water system. Overall, that reduction is indicative of looking at a total sub-basin wide sustainable yield of 311 to 323,000 acre feet a year. And really what I also want to make sure we remind everybody here is that this is just phase 1 of the process, and that overall that sustainable yield will be increased when we start looking at locally optimized projects and management actions. And so this really comes back to some of the thoughts that Phyllis shared with us earlier when it comes to, if there's any kind of managed recharge, any capturing of additional kind of supply side projects, we will see these results change. This is kind of effectively this is effectively the worst case scenario. And so, prior to honing in entirely on these numbers, I just want to make sure that everybody is aware and knows that this is kind of phase 1. We do have the next step, which is to look at what are supply side actions, and that when we get into this, that as far as our presentation of the GSP to the Department of Water Resources, the idea being that our projects and management actions will be incorporated into the final sustainable yield modeling, and that we will kind of revisit some of this demand reduction to account for anything we can't account for with supply side analysis. And that's because that's our end of goal, is that this is really the first step in targeting really how kind of getting a first idea to answer the question, well, how big do our projects have to be in order to not meet demand? Because at the end of the day, I don't want us to have to go the process of demand reduction, particularly to this magnitude. And so I want to make sure that everybody is aware that we still have one more step to go. We're trying, going to be doing our best to mitigate and increase these volumes. But this is the kind of the worst case scenario that we have if we just looked at demand reduction and had no supply side projects. And then, so for the sake of really, so that making sure that everybody understands our kind of where we're going with this in the future. The goal of this is that we need to kind of finalize and put our stamp on phase one. And so phase one here is the demand side solution. So one of the things I'm asking this group as a whole is I'd like to approve a phase one sustainable yield analysis for incorporation into the GSP, because so we do have to pick an iteration of or a version to put into to document what that would be. In addition to that, I kind of also want to make sure that we all note that in addition to the Turlock Subbasin, we are our neighbors to the north, particularly Modesto Subbasin, is utilizing the same model as us. We are kind of going at this process, the sustainable yield scenario model runs simultaneously between the two basins. And so there may be some minor tweaks, because if I have to make any refinements, particularly for their basin, they may affect our basin. So overall, I don't see any major refinements that are going to be required, but just on occasion, any impacts that we have for their simulation may affect this basin by a couple thousand acre feet or so. So I just want to make sure everybody knows that there may be some minor refinements towards the end of that. And then additionally that, and so then if we can finalize that today or in the next couple of weeks when it comes to coordinating.
Dominic, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Yes, once again, this is Milt. My question is, well, first of all, I'll just read a statement. In 2020, Stanislaus County added 5% more permanent acreage in tree crops. That's what was planted in 2020.
Yep.
I didn't see where you indicated in any of these charts that we're in these phase one charts that we're going to be adding 5% more tree crops during each annual year. I mean, this will just suck up everything that's going to, anything you find is going to be sucked up with this new acreage planting.
Absolutely. And I think that's really the critical component for consideration here, is that two steps is one is that the baseline does not account for any increase in agricultural acreage. And so that's an assumption that we would have to account for in addition to what we're currently simulating. Now, the other component to this is that the demand reduction is basically assuming that we're going the other direction, right? Because the consumptive use of our groundwater is effectively the yield and the evapotranspiration that it comes from our agricultural crops. And so really, particularly the impact of this demand reduction, whichever percentage we decide to go with as a basin, effectively is saying that we cannot continue to increase our agricultural acreage within the basin. And so without any supply side solutions, that we cannot continue to grow. And I think that comes to that's coming from how we implement this is more of a policy question for the GSAs rather than what I'm simulating in the model. So I do not currently have that simulated here. And in fact, the sustainable yield analysis is really showing the percentage that we've been talking about is actually a decrease overall in acreage or in the consumptive use that we are seeing within the basin. So and how we implement that is going to be a discussion for the GSAs.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is Rhett Calkins. I have a question. Point of clarification, Group 2 users. Group 2 users, let's say those are ones rely only on pumping. There are those agricultural users in the TID service area that could be labeled Group 2 users, just as the cities are labeled Group 2 users. Am I correct? There's individual farmers that could be Group 2 users. They just pump because it's easier to schedule the water, or they've got improvement district pipeline constraints, so they just rather pump.
Sure, that may be probably a better question answered by the Western GSA or a TID rep. But I would say in general, what I would say is, given kind of the regional nature of the modeling and the overall impact, particularly if they are TID customers but do not receive their surface water, that would be something that we would have to take into consideration. But it's beyond the resolution of the kind of and the knowledge of from the modeling perspective. And so again, I think that would come back to a question for the GSAs on how to handle those users from a purely a policy and a management perspective. And so how we want to represent them when it comes to our implementation of this, I think, is an excellent question that can be answered, probably from somebody more on the policy side than me.
Okay,
So
thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if someone else wants to add anything to that.
Dominic, this is Karen. You do have a question in the chat box, just
Yep.
so you know.
Yeah, I just noticed that. Give me 1 second to read it. So the question in the chat box says, how do you determine which wells affect the rivers? Do you plan on selectively regulating individual wells in order to better protect the river flows? That is an outstanding question. Effectively, what we're doing from a modeling perspective is that we're treating kind of the group 2 users as one big user. So we're not selectively selecting any specific wells in this modeling analysis, acknowledging that the basin as a whole impacts the river. Now, there are very localized conditions. Obviously, if someone has a well immediately river adjacent, they're going to impact it more than somebody further away. For the sake of the magnitude of the kind of the questions asked and a lot of the uncertainties as to both where those wells are located, how much volumes of water they pump, a lot of these are unknowns. And so from a purely kind of looking at a big picture, looking at kind of the subbasin as a whole, we're really just focusing on kind of equal distribution of pumping reductions across all those group 2 users. And that kind of goes back to that map. I can pull up if you'd like me, kind of to show you again. Okay. Yes.
Mike, I know this is a modeling exercise and it's really helpful. And you talked about it, that this 35% reduction would just be a disaster for US, as a grower. If I was a grower, I am a group 2 user because I live in Houston and we're dependent on groundwater. It's a little easier for me to go out and do something to reduce my water use. You ask a grower to reduce 35% water, you put them out of business. And so to think of it as, oh, we're going to present this to DWR as phase 1, that just doesn't sound good. So and maybe it's semantics and how you present it. I know it's an exercise to see, well, what's horrible, and it is.
Yep. And I think that's, oh, sorry, go ahead. I'm gonna let you finish.
Anyway, that's just it. That would be my shyness of, gosh, why would we present that to DWR? We don't want them to think that way. I don't think. We don't want, and maybe some people want ag to go out of business in our county, but I sure don't.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the main reasons why we're going to do our best when it comes to the phase 2, right? We do need to present a kind of this phase 1 option. We do need to acknowledge like basically how big is the problem, but the real point of phase 2 is, I don't think anybody on this call, and I definitely include myself amongst that. I don't want to make the burden any heavier than it needs to be. I understand that some of these numbers that we're looking at are foreboding, and the whole point of us trying to look at supply side solutions is to do our very best to help mitigate that as much as possible. And so our goal is, as we get into projects and management actions, and hopefully I think Phyllis is going to get back into those in a second here, is to really put everybody to put their thinking caps on and help us come up with some supply side projects that can really mitigate that reduction as much as we can, and help this basin be sustainable without having to go to such extreme lengths, focusing on pumping reductions, because I don't think that's the route we want to go, if at all possible.
I don't think this is Rhett Calkins again. I don't think ag is going to go out of business in this county. I think where we may end up eventually is that water has a value, and if those that can pay that value and still make a profit in farming, they're going to be farming. That's just my comment.
Yeah, thanks.
Dominic, this is John.
Yeah, why not look at it the other way, which is what projects and programs do we do first? And then what do we have to do in the way of demand reduction to make it work? But
sure.
Most of the growers I talk to, that's the way they think about it, is that way. And yeah, we'll do what we have to.
Yeah, so the need of going through a phase one is really particularly to give us an idea of the magnitude that we're looking on here. So if if we do want to look at the this 35 to 40%, that we're looking out at that overall on an annual basis, in order to supplement this demand reduction, we would need to find supply side solutions, in the approximate magnitude of 100,000 acre feet a year. I think it's really that this step is predominantly taken to make sure that we're all understanding that this is a very serious issue, and that something that we really need to dig deep to come up with those solutions if at all possible. And it really helps put the numbers into perspective before we get into really looking at specific projects and simulating each of those. And so it's really a question a lot of times of efficiency to get us to where we need to go. Sorry, John, did you have a question?
Yeah, I wondered if you could provide a definition of what you're calling a disconnection of a surface water body here and how you're describing it.
Sure. So effectively so disconnection of in this case, we're predominantly looking at the Merced River. Disconnection is to the point where our water levels are below the invert elevation of the river to the point in which that there is no response between the aquifer system and the river system itself. So there's no interaction between the two water bodies. And at least as of currently, the kind of the ad hoc committee and kind of we had a sit down and discussion with Merced Irrigation District, who operates the Merced River, and that conversation ended with the recommendation of setting those 2014 minimum thresholds. And so and that's going to be predominantly because of as of right now that they are seeing interaction between some of the localized wells in the area. Effectively, if they turn on a river adjacent well, they're seeing kind of an immediate response in stream flow downstream of that well. And so effectively, the kind of ad hoc had made the recommendation to me to make sure that we incorporate the threshold of those 2014 2014 stream level conditions or water level conditions.
Well, the stream is always going to leak out based on its wetted perimeter of how much water is in it, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And if they turn on a well nearby and it has an impact on the stream flow, then that is a connected well, correct?
Yes.
Do we have any evidence that there's a disconnection occurred? Any field evidence?
So I have not personally done any analysis here, and I think I would have to default you or kind of point you to Hisham, Matt, or a Merced ID representative to see exactly where they're doing this analysis for their kind of assumption here.
So is there any similar concern on the Tuolumne or observation that there's a disconnection between the river and the groundwater?
Sure. So the reason why, a lot of this, a lot of the presentation and the kind of this analysis I'm immediately doing right now is on the Merced River, is because right as of compare what our baseline scenario is showing is that on the Merced River, if conditions continue as we're projecting without any intervention or any sustainability intervention, the Merced River, the connectivity of the Merced River kind of moves. So we would getting to the point where the Merced River is losing connection further and further downstream. What we do see is that even under the 2015 minimum thresholds that we have set for the Tuolumne River, that river is still maintaining connection under those 2015 water levels. So we don't have to go to the point where we're adjusting the minimum thresholds to protect the Tuolumne River, that the existing minimum thresholds are sufficient in along that river.
Protect it from what?
Protect it from the designation. In this case, it'd be either of induced stream depletions beyond what the districts feel is significant and unreasonable.
I see. Thank you. Dominic, I have a couple of questions more they're really questions to me, help all of us learn a little bit more about this issue. So how does we're looking at like a 90 to 100,000 acre foot per year cutback. Let's just say all we have to do is demand reduction. That's what we have to do. How does that compare to other basins in our region you've worked on? I don't know how far you've got along with the Modesto, what you know about the Merced. How do we compare to others in our region?
Sure. So when it comes to particularly the Merced Subbasin, since they already have their GSP out, we're definitely significantly less overall than the Merced Basin when it comes to their sustainability conditions. So I believe, I don't have the exact number, but I want to say that Merced Subbasin is about 100, I want to say it's 158,000 acre feet a year that they need to account for. So we're definitely overall less of it as far as purely on the demand reduction side of things to achieve sustainability. And on the other hands, when it comes to the Modesto Subbasin, I want to say that we are more than what the Modesto Subbasin, but since their simulation is kind of still in the works, and that I haven't necessarily had to present that to them yet, I will say that we are definitely more than the Modesto Subbasin, but I probably don't think I should get too much into the details until they've had a chance to review this as well.
Okay, I appreciate that. Now, my second question was, this is kind of like a aggregated analysis, right? So you're looking at every tier 2 or group 2 user cutting back an equal amount.
Mm-hmm.
But does that have the effect of achieving the goal, is to address those 3 sustainability indicators? So groundwater levels, reduction of storage, and surface water interactions. So just want to help the group. So say for instance, TID turned off all the pumps near the San Joaquin River, all the drainage pumps, right? And that equaled 90,000 acre feet.
Mm-hmm.
And city of Ceres cut back, and we got to where we needed to go. Would that then address those indicators we're trying to do? Would that improve conditions in the Merced River? Would that boost groundwater levels?
Yeah.
Would that increase storage?
So that's a great question, and thank you for bringing it up so that I can help add some clarification to this. So we actually initially ran kind of the first few iterations of this simulation, looking kind of at different kind of spatial locations across the basin, and particularly kind of as Mike alluded to here, is that, you know, based on the kind of some of the localized conditions, some of the dynamics, the flow dynamics within the subbasin, is that there are definitely areas in the basin that have either greater or lower effects now, particularly given that the sustainability indicators for the Merced River, anything really the closer you are to the river, the greater impacts that you're going to have on the river. And I think that's you know, a pretty easy assumption to make. Now, predominantly when it comes to things like being adjacent to the other rivers, particularly downstream of this. So if we had a lot of wells that are immediately adjacent to the San Joaquin on the far western side of the basin, or up in Ceres, kind of in the north-ish western corner of the subbasin, is that effectively, since the flow dynamics are already kind of leading away from this from the Merced River, and that they're effectively, if you just turned off 100,000 acre feet of wells, or 100,000 acre feet of pumping in any of these areas, you're going to see very little impact on the Merced River, really anywhere within the basin. And so we did do it. We took an initial step in optimization, which is why we focused a lot of our demand reduction kind of with what we're considering our group 2 users, right, which is predominantly in the agriculture in the east, and it's going to be some of our city users. But there's definitely going to be a spatial component as far as optimization when it comes to you know, some of the other group 2 users, whether how much users in the north are impacting the southern boundary of the basin, whether the cities in the west, again on the northern side. There's a question as to how much that impact is going to be, but at the end of the day, there is a degree of uncertainty. We don't know how this is being implemented, and so there's a degree of uncertainty associated with that. And we're really hoping to get into some of this optimization when we get into phase 2, which is the real goal of this. And in fact, I actually have some of these kind of highlighted. I don't think I ever got to the second paragraph here, but really the idea is that we need to evaluate options to look at kind of like localized conditions, right? Can our supply side solutions really focus a lot of that recharge in the areas of critically concern, right? Particularly along the Merced River. Can we, how can we further refine the model when it comes to when it comes to some of these projects, how can we refine the model to really get into that kind of localized optimization? So as of right now, we're staying very, very big picture. But it is important to acknowledge, as Michael's alluding to, that that there are going to be localized conditions, and that not all impacts are created equal.
That's helpful, Dominic. I think that's obviously dealt with budgeting. You can do kind of across the board cuts, or you can look at cutting in certain areas that may have a bigger impact. Hopefully, like you said, this is phase one. It's just kind of an exercise. It's a paper exercise to show us the magnitude of the issue. And then as we delve into phase two, we're a little bit more clinical, a little bit more surgical in developing a more, a better response. So thanks for your work on that. More questions for Dominic? It's a tough topic and very detailed, but I appreciate everybody's input.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think just kind of to add to that, I just remember to remind everybody, we do have phase two, so I hope to be able to bring kind of another set of solutions to you. Hopefully we can, bring it into a little bit more palatable of a solution, and when we kind of get into the supply side projects. And so really the goal for that is, we're going to take the information that we have, we'll implement whatever supply side projects that the team and whether the TAC, some of the ad hoc staff, or any of the agencies, or anybody, please reach out to us and let us know if you have any feasible projects. And the idea being that we'll evaluate those that are that we have as potential projects, and then we can re-go through this exercise, and hopefully we can bring that demand reduction number down, hopefully significantly. So.
All right, thanks, Dominic.
Yep, thank you.
So yeah, phase one surgery with a hatchet. Hopefully next time we come back with a scalpel. So while it's it's not good news, as I think Mike Day and Rhett and some others pointed out. This is an action item that we recognize the phase one numbers for what they are to lead us into phase two. So with that, anybody in the West Turlock area like to make a motion to that effect?
So moved.
Thank you, Curtis. Do you have a second from anybody?
Second.
Okay, we had a tie there.
Hickman.
So Mike Pickock from Waterford Hickman seconded that. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, so that motion passes unanimously. Over to Matt on the East Turlock Subbasin.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Dominic, for the presentation. Again, great discussion. I'd like to entertain a motion recommending the inclusion of the phase one sustainable yield analysis as presented.
Move approval, Walt.
Okay, second.
This is Brody from Merced County. I can second.
Okay. All right, for all those in favor, please say aye.
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 All right, for those opposed, please signify by saying nay. Okay, motion carries.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Okay, on to item number 7. This is not an action item, just kind of a call for information, but this is regarding management actions that Phyllis needs information for. So Phyllis, over to you. We lost Phyllis.
All right, I got you up now. Can everybody see the screen okay?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
great, thanks. All right, just a couple of more items. Hang in there with me. Just a couple more slides. Projects and management actions. So here's a slide that you've seen before with respect to projects and management actions. It just simply talks about which portion of the regulations provides the information that's needed to put into the GSP. And I won't go through this in detail. If you want to, you can look at subarticle 5 of the GSP regulations. It's not very long and it gives you some information, but specifically what we're doing. So as I had mentioned before, we're developing a working table with projects and management actions to be updated and revised as we go on an ongoing basis. We need to update project details as available, and we need to start doing this sooner rather than later. So we need both details to be able to do the sustainability modeling that Dominic has been talking about. We also just need some general information which is required in the regulations. So templates, data requests are coming to the project sort of proponents or the responsible agencies soon. And we need to make a list of additional projects. So what I thought I would do is to just get the project list out to the TAC. It's very basic right now, but it includes some of the details that we're going to be needing for the GSP. And so this is coming, and I wanted to give you a heads up on this when you get it in the email. TAC members would appreciate your response. We'll give you some deadlines and some details in the email. We're also compiling lists of management actions for consideration. We're focused on what's being done and what's being useful from other subbasins, including adjacent basins, and considering what actions might be needed to complement our monitoring and compliance with the sustainable management criteria. And then obviously we need a plan to fill data gaps as we go forward as well. So these are details that are coming, and you're gonna also get some information from Woodard and Curran, which is gonna be asking you for some details for the modeling. And then just so you'll have some kind of an idea about what I'm talking about, here's a list. So project type and description, the details that are they're gonna need to be able to model it include location, when the project starts, the sources of water, volumes, timing, duration, infrastructure needs, and schedule. For the GSP, we need to speak to the benefits of the project, specifically how they benefit measurable objectives and what benefits they offer to the sustainable yield. We'll need to document regulatory and permitting processes as needed. And we need to also recognize the legal authority of the responsible agency that is planning to move forward on the project. And when I say the responsible agency, obviously the projects are being sponsored by the GSAs, but there will usually be one member agency that is taking the lead on it. And so we need to make sure that that everything is in place for that to occur. Obviously, we're going to need some estimated costs, and the GSP actually wants to know how you're going to fund things. And so I know everyone is hoping for implementation grant funding that is coming out soon. So we're anticipating that, and also prioritizing projects that we feel like would be most beneficial for getting in front of the grant program. And then finally, a last detail there, triggers for implementation. So that just gives you a sense of what the GSP is requiring. Our next steps, of course, is going to be working on the monitoring network as well as additional sustainable management criteria. We're making our way through the list quite rapidly, thanks to the ad hoc committee. And so we're going to continue that process and then really getting into projects and management actions as we go forward. So that's it for me. Thank you very much for all of your participation, feedback, great discussion today. Love to have everybody providing input. So appreciate everyone, and that's it for me. So back to you, Michael.
Thank you, Phyllis. Okay, so moving now towards the tail end of our agenda, item number 8, Sigma related updates. This is where we just update the group on things that are happening, that are generally working on, no action will be taken. So we have 2 items, a public outreach update and the grant update. So Herb, are you up first?
Yeah, I'll take that first. Thank you, Michael. Just 2 quick little items. It would be probably one unless I didn't hear what I heard this morning at a conference. So 2 items. The first is the facilitation support services program that we applied to get funding from the Department of Water Resources. We submitted that on April 28th, along with a draft scope of work for 3 tasks for that funding. And we spoke with the consultant that DWR works with on May 4th last week and answered a few clarifying questions so that they could develop some a further scoping on their end as they work with the department. So that is good news. We haven't heard official word from the department, but everything would lead us to believe that we are well on our way to receiving those support services from the department. And as you will recall, there were 3 tasks, one of which was various meeting facilitations provided from a consultant. And then the second one was a GSP adoption toolkit with various items in there for outreach during the GSP adoption, prior to GSP adoption. And then the last was some recorded presentations for outreach as well. And so those 3 things may or may not be modified by the time we get official word from the department, but that process continues on, and I would think that we would hear soon from the department related to the status of that. So that is good news. The second item is that I heard this morning, it's just a small piece that I wasn't even going to report, but I figured it's valuable for the context. DWR's director, Carla Nemeth, was at a conference this morning for the Association of California Water Agencies. It's the largest association of water agencies in the state. And she said 2 things about Sigma in her keynote address this morning. One was they understand, she says, quote, "We understand that in Sigma, these plans are works in progress, and we do not expect perfection." And I'll just make note that related to that, as we move forward, we have not only annual reporting that we do to the department, but every 5 years, the plan is required to be updated. And so we have ample opportunity in that. And so I just wanted to remind the group as we talk about all these details, me not being a detail guy, they're very important, but at the same point in time, we have opportunity as we move forward, and the DWR is openly flexible with the plans, of course, pending as long as we adhere to their regulations that they have out there. So, and the law itself. So I just wanted to make that note, and that is it for me, unless there's questions.
Any questions for her? Okay, with that, handing over to Debbie, grant update.
Thank you. And thank you, Herb, for that reminder. That's a really important reminder. We tend to get lost in all the details, including myself. And we have to remember that we have to get this done and adopted by the GSAs and submitted to DWR on time to meet our objective. I mean, it's a collective, our objective to be successful for these GSAs and for the Subbasin and the community. So thank you for the reminder, Herb. Just a couple things. You guys are going to be, I say you guys, the TAC members, agencies will see some information circulated on the draft documentation for the wells that are going to be installed under the grant program. We anticipate going out to bid at the end of May. We'll be utilizing TID's purchasing processes as have been approved by the West Turlock Subbasin GSA. And we hope to have that wrapped up and begin installing wells later this summer. So stay tuned, but we'll circulate those draft documents so you have a chance to provide comments if you wish to. Also, we have a draft PEIR that will be developed under that grant program. That will start to be becoming more of an item that we'll start talking about as we move into projects and management actions, as Phyllis has indicated in her earlier presentation. So stay tuned for that. The GRAT is the other project funded under our Prop 68 grant, and that is continuing to move forward, and we will be hearing more about it in June and July. Lastly, moving forward with the draft sections of the GSP, the East and the West Turlock ad hoc committee has been working back and forth on some of the language within the first 3 sections of the administrative draft of the GSP. We are very close. I think I've said that before, but we keep inching closer, and hope to have something back to the consultant, or no, to the TAC for their review, and then the consultant team, so that we can then present to the GSAs on those first 3 sections. After that, the GSAs could take action to release it to the public for comment, and that would make it then publicly available. And I think at the last TAC meeting, we talked about the process we plan to use for that. So if you have an interest and you weren't able to participate in the last meeting, go back and look on our website, on the calendar, and you can take a look at the presentation, as well as view the YouTube video if you have any questions. We do plan on reaching out to the GSAs to schedule a joint GSA meeting to release the draft. So they would have a joint presentation from the consultant team. Everyone would be hearing the same things, and there would be an opportunity for interaction between the GSAs. So that is the approach that we're seeking, and we'll be looking to move forward with. So that's all I had.
Okay, thanks, Debbie. Any update from various agencies this time? Okay, hearing nothing. So the next regular scheduled meeting of the Joint Technical Advisory Committee is Thursday, May 27th, 2021. And for those of you who are interested, at 5 o'clock tonight, also on Zoom, is the regular meeting of the West Turlock Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Agency. So these are elected and appointed officials who will be acting on, I think the main thing tonight is the budget for the West Turlock Subbasin, but their purview is the West Turlock Subbasin. So they'll begin their normal updates in adopting the budget for the West Turlock Subbasin. So that's 5 o'clock. It's on Zoom. If you go to the website, you'll find a link to it. As Debbie mentioned, Herb and others really do a good job of maintaining the website. So if you're new to Sigma and what's going on in the region, I encourage you to go to the website and look at the resources there. So with that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn the West Turlock Subbasin Technical Advisory Committee.
I'll move.
Should, oh.
So a move from Debbie, and it looks like Leandro seconded that.
Yeah, I'll second that.
Thanks, Leandro. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Aye. Okay, West Turlock Subbasin Technical Advisory Committee is adjourned. Over to you, Matt, for the East Turlock.
Thank you, Michael. So looking to adjourn the East Turlock Technical Advisory Committee meeting. Looking for a motion.
Move to adjourn.
Okay, a motion from Brody Patterson, Merced County. Second.
I'll second. Dennis from Cortez.
All right, we get a second from Dennis. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 All right, for those not in favor, please signify by saying nay. It's opposed, huh?
No one.
All right, motion carries. Meeting is adjourned 3:56, right?
Thanks, good. It was a great joint meeting, and we'll see you guys in a couple more weeks. Thanks, take care.